Vall Herard, CEO of Saifr. Welcome to the Insight Jam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Being a local company in the Boston area, we're curious about what's happening with some of the new technology. But first, before we get into the opportunity for Saifr, tell me a little bit about Fidelity Labs and how it's incubated Saifr.
Sure. So, as you might suggest or surmise, rather from the name, Fidelity Labs is the innovation and incubator arm of Fidelity Investments. The lab itself has been around since 2005, and the mandate was primarily internally focused. It was a way in which we can accelerate innovation into some of the business units. About 4 years or so ago, the focus shifted a little bit to have more of an outward focus, with the idea being that are there ways in which we can take advantage of Fidelity Investments assets, including data, where we have a right to use that data, which we'll get into later in terms of ethical AI and what that means in terms of data and data usage. But where we can use that data to build businesses where we can sell the technology externally. If Fidelity happens to be the first user of the technology that we build in the labs, then that's great. But the focus is really to drive an alternative source of revenue for the company that's not tied to assets under management or assets under advisory.
Yeah, I just came up to speed on the whole idea and went to the Fidelity Labs site and saw they've actually launched 3 businesses. It appears, Saifr being one of them. And it's interesting because Saifr is clearly right in the wheelhouse of what Fidelity would want, I would expect, in a solution. Is that how you're thinking about it?
Yes, that's how we're thinking about it. But as I mentioned earlier, we think that the rest of the industry would want the solution as well. And I think some of the early success that we've had is a testament to that idea. When you think about the fact that a lot more content is getting generated, and it's become easier to generate content with the advent of generative AI, if you're in a regulated industry, all of that content needs to undergo compliance review. And so the idea behind Saifr was to build a capability that would allow you to review content, keeping in mind that there are certain regulations that in certain industries that you have to follow with anything that the public can either see, so let's say it's a graph of some sort, or hear, so audio, such as this podcast, or else read content, written content. All of that needs to be compliant. And so consequently, we set about building, before GPT became famous, back in 2020, we started thinking about ways in which we could build a capability that could look at content and understand the context and make sure that that context is as compliant, because it is a model, it is going to get certain things wrong, but is as compliant as possible. And so we set about building that capability, and we brought it to market.
Yeah. So as we think about things at Solutions Review, we think about things in category, and the category I think that you have identified as regulatory tech, regtech. Is that kind of the term?
Yes.
That's being used, and at least in the news release from Fidelity when Saifr was launched. It says that Saifr harnesses the massive amount of compliance data at its disposal and the power of deep learning models to augment the work of content creators and compliance professionals. And so I gather that this is generative AI for compliance. Is that how you think about it?
It is for compliance, but what I would say is that it is for content creators as well. So, for example, one of our clients, they use a lot of influencers that create YouTube postings. And you, as a financial services company, for example, you cannot mislead investors by using an influencer. And so that content needs to be compliant. And the review process around that kind of content is very time consuming. Because as you might imagine, someone will record something, someone needs to listen to it and say, no, you can't say this, say that instead. Or else someone needs to produce a script, which for influencers, there's no such thing as scripts, right? And so before you can actually put that content out there so that you don't end up misleading investors, because ultimately it's about keeping the financial system safe and investors' money safe. And so consequently, the application of our system allows us, for example, to capture an audio video file and go through it and identify areas where something may be non-compliant very, very quickly. And so an influencer can, for example, use it and get instant feedback, and then they can restate something before they actually post it. And then there's an auditing trail that allows the company itself to say, okay, what was being produced. That being said, that doesn't remove the responsibility by the company to have a human person, a compliance expert, review it as well. And the same applies in marketing. So you might think of someone who's working at a regulated company in financial services or other industries that are regulated as well, where they're writing copy, and that copy needs to be compliant. If they have the capability of having, let's say, something similar to a grammar check for compliance, as they are putting the content together and writing it and building it, then by the time they submit it for review by a compliance review expert, it's closer to being compliant. And so there's less cycle time. On average, what we found is that in some instances, we can reduce the amount of time by up to 10x the amount of time that it takes without using Saifr.
Yeah, no, it's a wild new world of content creation out there, and you're right with regard to influencers and just the speed of content creation, and honestly now with generative AI and generative video creation through AI, it's only going to get more complex out there, and I think there has been some fast and loose behavior
yes.
in the markets, because the content is just being created so rapidly that it's almost impossible to harness, A, and B, I think there's a real sense out there that that the regulatory agencies are going to be overwhelmed anyway, and that it doesn't really matter. They'll never see it.
Well,
but I know that's the wrong approach, and again, this is why I said initially I think this is built perfectly by Fidelity, because ultimately there has to be an adult in the room around this sort of wild west of content creation.
yes, and the reason why Fidelity, to go back to your earlier point, is the fact that the sort of data that you need to do this kind of work is not readily available.
Right. So the large language model that you guys are leveraging is primarily a Fidelity proprietary collection?
So the way that I would phrase it is that because all the capabilities that we've built, they're intended to work with any large language model. And so essentially, the data sets that we have access to is really the collective human intellect of thousands of compliance officers over years of reviewing a lot of content and understanding the context of when someone is talking about a particular type of product, right? And to harness that and try and replicate that as best as possible via a model representation, knowing full well that the model will get some things wrong. just as we humans sometimes get things wrong as well. And so consequently, the granular level detail and giving the breadth, if you will, and the depth of Fidelity's various businesses is what allowed this to happen. The fact that there's a fairly large asset management business, a large retail investment business, FI, or Fidelity Institutional business, the charitable organization, even the insurance part of Fidelity. It's the fact that there's a lot of data from a number of different kinds of financial services that allowed us to see how the rules are applied in different contexts so that we could build a model that not only can help you generate things that are compliant, but if you were to take our API, for example, and wrap it around a large language model, which is something that large language models struggle with, the fact that if you go out there and you ask any one of the freely available large language models, it generates something for me. They're incapable of generating things that are compliant with industry rules and regulations. But you can take Saifr.ai's API and wrap it around such large language models and make the content that's coming out of these large language models compliant or closer to being compliant, right? Because because these are models, they're not going to get everything because there are certain areas that really rely on human judgment and the fact that you might have someone with 20 years of compliance experience, but it will get it closer to being compliant, and through that process, reduce the cycle time that it takes to get content out of the door.
I see the unique selling proposition based upon the fact that Fidelity is the incubator and that Fidelity has a culture of compliance rigor and certainly can bring that level of credibility to a solution that's chief benefit is to keep you out of the compliance weeds, so to speak. I'm curious about how sales is going. I mean, as you bring it to the market, it does seem that there are a lot of companies that are, and these large language models do have effectively the entire corpus of all regulatory and compliance language in them. And I've got to believe that the generative AI compliance market is going to be robust because it's a necessary solution to have. So how are you finding the markets as you bring this out and talking to clients?
Yeah, so things are going great. But I do want to touch on one of the points that you made earlier in terms of why we built this. So despite the fact, for example, that you might start off with content to train, let's say, a large language model, and everything is perfectly compliant with the corpus that you are starting with, when you ask it to generate something, it often will generate something that's non-compliant, even though everything that it's been trained on is compliant.
I understand,
because it's generating something new. And so consequently, that's one of the reasons why we built it. And so I would say that the reception in the marketplace has been very positive. We launched the product in 2022, so a little bit over 2.5 years ago. And so far, through direct selling, we're a private company, so there's a lot of details that I can't go into. But needless to say that sales have been where we expected to be at this point in our journey. And I think that we are just about to hit the J curve from an exponential growth perspective.
So does Fidelity, as they have started to launch solutions now out of Fidelity Labs, do they see it as an advantage to have basically massive corporate clients as part of I mean, do you see it as an advantage that Fidelity has massive corporate clients that would be, in my opinion, at the top of the funnel and top of my funnel?
Yes. So I don't speak on behalf of Fidelity in this respect, but as you might imagine, every time you launch a business, and given the history of innovation by Fidelity, I think that certainly we all want it to be successful. And so with that said, I think from our perspective, it's really at this point going out and getting more clients. And so we've just recently hired a head of sales for the first time in the history of the company because of the growth potential that we see with Saifr.
The world is going to change dramatically. We're fascinated at the moment in time that we're in, where technology has now begun to provide the ability to generate independent content that is, just not being created directly by humans. I know you refer to this technology as human augmented, I believe is the term.
Yes.
Human augmented, is that the term?
Yeah, no, that's the term that we're using because we don't see this as something that can sit by itself, meaning that you can't, for example, license Saifr and start using it and say, oh, we don't need compliance people. It doesn't work that way. The way that we see it,
how do you control that?
So the way that we see it is that when we speak with a client, when we are engaged with a client, and we go through a proof of concept to demonstrate the value of the tool, what we always tell people is that this is a model. It's not expected to catch everything that FINRA or the SEC or regulator would look for, that you still need to have the human review process. But that if you have someone who's working in marketing, whose job is not to know all of these rules, right? Can it augment the work that they're doing so that by the time they do have a compliance person take a look at it, there's less to review, and the compliance person, the experienced compliance person, can spend more time on really the stuff that requires value judgment or human judgment that you can never catch with a model. And so through that process, we are augmenting the work and making it easier for content creators, marketers to be as creative, but within the confines of what's compliant. And so that by the time compliance reviews it, there's a lot less for them to do, if you will.
The entire library of compliance language exists, and it has been aggregated into a large language model, and it is by and large agreed upon that this is what this is how compliance reads, and these are these terms, these created content documents are compliant. Doesn't generative AI, I know we're in the early stages, obviously. I consider it the very early stages. However, aren't we going to rapidly get to a point where it's learned by its own mistakes, and in the end, the human element isn't going to necessarily need to be there?
I think at some point we may very well reach that. I guess what I was saying is that we're not close to that.
Right? I got that part.
Yeah,
You have to be looking down the path.
Certainly.
I think we all expect
exactly right
to eventually get to a point where I mean, that's the promise, right? That it's performing in a superhuman kind of way.
Yeah, no, I think that's you're quite right. That's part of the promise that eventually things will evolve. I think the issue that we have right now, and it's not even clear that we have the right architecture that can solve some of these more general problems, right? So let's start there. But with the current architecture that all of these large language models are based on, when it is generating something new, for example, because you might think of it as a fairly complex interpolation. And as we all remember from our math classes, whenever you do an interpolation, there's going to be some level of error. And so consequently, even if you start with perfectly training data that's perfectly compliant, you will generate things that are potentially non-compliant. So, for example, in the area of image generation, and so if you're a marketer, you're going to have some sort of graphic in there. So images can be non-compliant as well. So imagine that you generate an image of something that is super luxury, right? And then you have that in ad or a copy for a financial product that has, let's say, low returns. If you embed that in there, that could be indicative of you misleading a potential investor. Because in that instance, you are saying, hey, by investing in this thing, we promise you high returns. Someone can interpret it in that way, right? And so because these rules are really designed to try and keep investors safe, that's an instance where one of the capabilities that we've built is to look at the image, look at the context to try and decipher whether or not that is potentially compliant or non-compliant. So that's just one example of something that these large language models are not capable of solving for right now.
And so is that the unique selling proposition right now, is that if you are going to get into the generative AI space with regard to being in a regulated industry, that you need safer? I mean, maybe that's why you branded it as you did.
Yes.
You need to be safer.
Yes, exactly. It makes you a little bit safer. And also, even in the instances, what we've seen where you have AI-generated content, humans who are not compliance experts, who don't have the compliance background, will go in there and make edits. No one, for example, in a business setting is taking out, what's coming out of ChatGPT, for example, and using that in a formal business setting. There are going to be edits made to it. Right?
I might challenge you on that one.
Well, if it's compliant,
I think it's wild out there right now.
No, it is wild, and it shouldn't be. So let me rephrase that. It shouldn't be that way, right? In other words, if you're in an industry where it needs to be compliant, someone is going to take it and make some edits to it, right? And then even through the editing process, if the person doing the editing, again, we should not expect that someone who's a creative marketer should know all the compliance rules, right? And so consequently, having an aid, something similar to a grammar check, for example, for compliance that can help them, that's where we see the value. But also, if the content is entirely created from AI or generated from AI, we can also ingest that kind of content and look for things that are potentially non-compliant. Another area, for example, I'm sure that you've seen it whenever you get a financial statement from any financial company. It's maybe a couple of sentences of content and maybe 2 pages of disclosures. So one of the capabilities that we've built is to ingest the disclosure library that a particular institution is using,
right,
read and understand the content and say, hey, these are the suggested disclosures that you might need for this content. And so that helps reduce the friction, again, in creating content that's compliant and getting that content to market faster.
Yeah, it strikes me that that latter example of kind of the long form regulatory disclosure language is still a fairly contained content creation process, and there's, I believe there's probably still a fairly robust compliance department in most regulated industries that are handling that sort of thing. I think where it gets a little sticky, and where it gets a little more potentially unruly is on the marketing side, where you do have a little more freedom with language, if you will, and the idea that, again, I think that's always been on the edge. I think it's even prior to large language models and machine learning. It's always been where organizations are going to get into trouble, most likely. I don't think the regulators are looking as hard at the long form disclosure stuff as they are at the fancy marketing packages and claims around performance.
Well, I mean, I don't speak on behalf of obviously that's of the regulators,
But you know what I'm saying. I mean, it's always the marketing department that's going to get you in trouble. Let's face it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are content standards that every institution, if you regulated by FINRA or the SEC, that you need to follow, right? And are there institutions that are more aggressive than others? Yes. I think there's one rule book for everyone, but within that rule book, there's room for interpretation. And some firms, and no model is going to stop you, by the way, from doing that, right? Ultimately, if, for example, I'll use again the grammar example. If you write something and you misspell something, and you have a grammar check, it says, hey, this is how you spell it, but you don't have to accept that, right? Someone can just ignore that, right? And so consequently, the way that we see it, and that's why we use the term human augmentation, we think that it helps you, but there isn't anything stopping you from saying, hey, I'm going to ignore the suggestion that's being provided to me here. Because that's the other thing that we do within our modeling. If we do detect that there is something that is potentially compliant, we give you an explanation as to why it's potentially non-compliant and give you suggested language that you are free to choose, because we don't take on the liability of saying that, oh, we told you it's compliant, so therefore if you use it, you're out of trouble. Ultimately, the responsibility is with you. But we do try and help in that way.
So again, my earlier point around, it seems like the overwhelming amount of content that's going to be created out of generative AI will soon swamp the regulators. Do you see yourself potentially having clients on the regulations, on the regulator side? I mean, would they come to you and say, you know what, we actually don't have enough employees to keep a track of all this stuff, and we could use a technology like this to as a kind of a first sweep against everything that's flooding the financial markets?
Sure. I mean, I think from our perspective, we think that regulatory bodies can certainly use Saifr just as anyone else could. But that being said, I think that on a global basis, I remember speaking at a conference in London last year, and the regulators in Europe as well. They have large teams of data scientists working on various aspects of regulation. I don't want to speak on behalf of the regulators, but certainly we think that a tool like Saifr can be used by regulators as well as industry.
So it's my strong opinion that AI is going to decimate the information worker across the board. So, and as it does, because in the end, capitalism is undefeated. It wants to find cheaper solutions to the cost centers within their organizations. So they're naturally going to gravitate toward artificial intelligence generated content, and they're going to naturally gravitate toward the potential of having a system like Saifr handle the compliance, because in the end, it can faster and more completely, and maybe with a little higher level of confidence than the team of humans that are currently doing that sort of thing. How do you feel? I mean, you've been looking at AI. You're an MIT guy. You've been around a bit. You've seen a thing or two. Where are we headed with regard to how AI is going to land on the information worker in organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, with respect to what we do first, and then I kind of like talk about more general.
I'm not saying you need to give it the Saifr perspective. Sure. I'm curious about your broader thoughts.
Yes, and so I think that AI is going to revolutionize, as you said, the workplace. I think
That's
we
another
are
way to put
seeing,
it.
right? I think we are seeing it happen now. But the one thing that I would caution is that we're not at that point yet. In other words, a lot of the early promises have not been realized yet. And one of the things that actually, there was some work coming out of MIT and in a few other institutions about the fact that we are probably in the next 3 years going to run out of data to train these models. And yet there's a lot of problems that haven't been solved yet, right? And so, yes, you can use AI to generate more data, synthetic data, but there are problems associated with that as well. That we can get into. And so, from my perspective, I think a lot of the things that you mentioned is on point, right? The fact is that if I look at even within the work that Saifr does, it takes you less time to review documents than without it. And so I do think that the impact is going to be substantial. I do think that we have some ways to go yet, however, before we see the full potential. But if you were to ask me, okay, project out, a few decades from now, what the impact will be, I do think that workers are going to have to be retrained in certain, what I would call mundane tasks that are repeatable, where you can validate with a high degree of confidence that a model can do just as well. And so, and again, AI is data. Data is generated by information workers. And so your comment in terms of the impact on information workers, I think is on point. I just think that the revolution is going to be delayed somewhat.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been through several revolutions. I went through the PC revolution. I went through the internet revolution. This feels a lot like when Netscape Navigator landed. ChatGPT feels a lot like Netscape Navigator, where all of a sudden a browser unlocked what the internet really was. This wasn't just a bunch of, command line messaging. This was now rendering HTML in, very appealing presentations on screens. And it didn't take long after the browser landed that, we had e-commerce and we had social media and I mean, it was less than 10 years after the browser landed that we had everything.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Everything, including the largest corporations that now exist. I mean,
yes.
Google and Amazon, and I mean, these things did not exist. Facebook, and now they do. And I keep saying to everybody who will listen, the titans of the next revolution, of this revolution, aren't even out of high school yet. We don't even know their names. They're coming. Bezoses and the Zuckerbergs, they haven't arrived yet. But when they do, they will be bigger than those guys.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think again, if you look at it takes time for technology to work its way through the economy, right? It takes time. So if you using your example,
but not that much time. That's the thing. It
well,
feels
exactly,
like long
right?
to you and I because we're humans, but in the scheme of things, I mean,
yes,
we're rocketing.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
As a society, this is an absolute out of control freight train that I don't think we. And this is why I worry about the information workers. I just don't think people realize like innovation can't stop itself. It can't throttle itself. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be unbridled, and it will be, and it will just like it did in e-commerce. Just like there are so many businesses now that don't exist that existed in the 90s. There are going to be jobs that are going to get obliterated.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. But new jobs are going to get created, right? So five
That's what
years
everybody
ago,
says.
well,
Like,
5 years
help
ago,
me
right?
understand that.
So
Help me understand that.
5 years ago, you'd be very hard pressed to find in uh, any job description for a prompt engineer.
True.
That didn't exist, right?
That's true.
And also, if you think about the fact that roughly about 80% of the jobs that we have today were created really over the last, because of innovation, over the last 70 years, right?
Yep.
And so innovation creates jobs, takes away jobs, but also create jobs, right? But going back to what you were saying, and I do believe this as well, that innovation cannot be stopped. So if you, going back to the internet story, right? So the official quote unquote start of the internet is when computer networks started talking to one another, right? In 1983. So
Correct.
if you actually look at world GDP growth, the previous 3,000 years, right, in world GDP growth from 1983 to where we are now, you look at that graph and it's like flat lines, right, for almost 3,000 years.
This
And
is the hockey stick you were talking
right,
about earlier.
exactly. And then from 1983 on, it started going up, and then comes the 90s, right? So you basically fast forward, let's call it 12 years later, and all of a sudden, an explosion happened, right? And so I think that we are standing at the foothills of something similar that's going to happen. That being said, I do think that it's not all gloom and doom, because again, AI has a long way to go. So for example, you take self-driving cars, right? We've been trying for a very long time to teach a car to drive itself in under any condition whatsoever. Something that it would take you 20 hours to teach a 17-year-old how to do it. And we're still not at a point yet where this is perfected technology, despite years of investment in that space. And so this is where I think that although the technology holds great promise, and we are at a point where we will see it move much faster than it was before, then in the previous 10 years, there's going to be more innovations, quite frankly, in the next year than happened in the last 10 years in this space. But we are still in many respects at the infancy of this. But to your point, if I look at the 10-year-old now, who's going to be the titan of the industry in another 15, 20 years, it is coming. It is being embedded in everything that we do. And the question is, how do we make sure that it's done in an ethical way as well, right? So there are ethical considerations in terms of what sort of AI that we actually end up building, and where do we get the data to actually build AI systems that are, that keep people safe, that observe the rules that we have to keep markets, for example, in financial services, fair to everyone. And so I think those are the things that we're going to have to struggle with as a society, and putting the guardrails in place to make sure that as this technology evolves, it's done in a way in which it protects the investor at the end of the day, right? I think one of the worst things that we could possibly do, not to get into Bitcoin or anything like that, but I think although it was a great underlying technology, initially saying that, oh, we have this thing, so therefore we can ignore all the laws that were put on the books around banking, was a mistake. I don't think we should repeat that with AI.
Yeah, well, I'll have you back for another episode, and we'll talk about blockchain and the IMF and Bitcoin and how digital currencies will eventually evolve.
I'd love to have that conversation,
because I have no doubt in my mind that the Bitcoin reckoning is on its way, and there's no way that the Fed and the IMF are going to allow this to. I think they've thought it was quite curious and interesting, and I think almost a petri dish for what they ultimately will want to build. But we can get into all that later. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about your path, because I have a couple of kids who are now up and out and into the workforce, and they're going to, hopefully find their way through a successful path despite the pressures of AI and so forth. What are some of the decisions you made along the way? So you've had a very interesting career. I mean, and now you're CEO of a startup, effectively. I mean, talk a little bit about decisions that you remember making that led you here versus leading you potentially to somewhere else.
Yes, no, definitely. So I was always interested in math. In high school, I always found it very fascinating. I was, I guess, one of the people who liked really doing the proofs more so than really doing the exercises, because I thought that was a lot more interesting. And so that ultimately led to me studying mathematical economics or econometrics and engineering. I actually my first major was to go into engineering, mechanical engineering, to be precise, because I wanted to build rocket ships. And I thought this was very, very interesting. And I remember I had a professor, an economics professor at NYU, at Syracuse at the time for undergrad school. And he said, hey, if you can solve a linear set of equations, there are these things called derivatives that are being traded on Wall Street. And that's who Wall Street is hiring now. And so is that something that you are interested in? And when I was in high school, I'm dating myself here, but I remember I used to listen, my brother and we used to listen to Louis Rockefeller and Wall Street Week on Fridays. That used to be on PBS. And so I always had this interest in Wall Street, but I never thought I would end up there. And so I graduated and then went to work on Wall Street, of all places. And so started doing that. And I worked at a few institutions, primarily on the quantitative side, ultimately in market risk, credit risk, and trading. And I started getting a little bit bored with that. And I took a job as a consultant, working for, at the time, a firm that I thought were doing some fairly innovative IT capabilities that they were building. Was founded by a couple of professors out in California. And they were looking at ways to apply Monte Carlo simulations to solve some risk management problems. And so I went and worked there. That allowed me to travel around the world, which was part of what I was looking for. So I ended up working on a risk solution in Shinhan in South Korea, for example, for Shinhan Bank at the time. So I was and I enjoyed that. And so that took me around the world. And so I was like, well, this technology thing sounds like fun. I want to stay there a little bit longer. And so I bounced around a few technology companies.
Mostly in financial services?
Mostly in financial services. I was head of financial engineering for a company called Numerics, for example, where there we were trying to build models that traders can use to price fairly complex products. Like a Himalayan option, a dual currency, cross currency swap with a range accrual.
The technology innovation in financial services was legendary from 2000, really over the past 25 years, I would say. It's been remarkable how financial services firms have leveraged technology and modeling in order to just improve returns. I mean, across the board.
Yeah, and so a lot of the math from engineering carries over to a lot of the work that was being done in quantitative finance at the time. Because of my background in econometrics, although we were calling it econometrics at the time, but really it was kind of like the first generation of these AI models where you were looking at different kinds of regression and regression analysis and trying to explain what a regression model was doing. As a matter of fact, these all of these large language models are based on this notion of autoregressive modeling capabilities. And so that then led me back to finance a little bit. I was working at a company that ended up getting sold. It was also a startup where I was the North American CEO for this UK-based company, Edinburgh, so Scottish-based company. That ended up being sold. And then after that, I did a few consulting projects. And then the opportunity came up at Fidelity about 4 years ago when the lab was going through this transition. And when I came in, there was a role, but there wasn't a job. There was just this notion that regtech, regulatory compliance technology, was a thing. And so what the lab was looking for was more or less an entrepreneur in residence to come in and say, hey, what are some of the things that we should think about building in this space? And so there were many ideas that we were thinking about, and we settled on this one, presented it to the investment committee as something that we think is worthwhile to do. But that's at some point you can apply it to other industries as well.
So some of the folks that we talked to say that, you know, one of the better things that they decided as they were moving through their career was to work for clients in projects, because you really do start to understand the need to build for a particular customer or effectively an audience, even if it's an audience of one, versus just being kind of a contributor in a large organization where you're kind of just performing your role very well, and certainly there's value there. I mean, was there any particular type of role that you thought, you know, I'm glad I did that because that's really allowed me to see what products need to look like, or work with people differently, or work maybe better on the sales side? I mean, what was your experience there?
Coming up on, or growing up, I should say, on more of the technical side. And then for one of the earlier technology companies that I was working for, I was the person that the sales team would bring to client meetings to have the technical, here's how this model works versus that model. And I think through that process and sitting down with clients and listening and understanding what they're trying to solve and working with them in terms of the best way to solve that, those earlier lessons have been invaluable in terms of when you are thinking about a product, you need to think about who's going to use it first and foremost, and go and speak with those people because you're not solving it for yourself. Ultimately, you're solving it. You're trying to solve it for a broad group of people. And so I think the skill sets that I learned through that process of being really the technical sales engineer, so to speak, working with some terrific sales leaders, that also allowed me to learn the sales side of the business. And at some point, one of the things that I didn't mention, in one of these iterations at a technology company, I was actually in sales. And so I had a quota, I had to carry a quota and go and speak with clients and
I used to have the full head trash around, I'll never do sales. You know, I think everybody kind of thinks of sales from a certain perspective early on that, you know, that's not something I'm really want to be doing, and that's not for me. But then when you're kind of forced into it, and I was forced into it in a in a roundabout way, you begin to realize it's an absolute great piece of experience.
No, it is. And also, I mean, what I always tell even my engineers is that if your company builds a product, you work in sales. You may not be client facing, but if your company builds a product that somebody else is going to buy, you work in sales. And so I've always had that mentality because to me, I think a lot of times people don't want to talk to salespeople, but I think it's a question of approach, right? I think approach the right way. To your point, I think it's just an incredible experience in terms of you learn a lot through that process by just listening to clients and working with them and trying to solve their needs and understand that ultimately whatever you build, it's for the benefit of the client. Because if you don't have any clients, well, you're not gonna, you don't have to worry about the rest.
So what do you look for? So as you're building out the business, what do you look for in terms of characteristics that are kind of must have in a candidate, regardless of the position? Do you try to unearth very specific personality types, or try to? Are there any specific questions that you ask that you think you can get somebody to reveal themselves? Or what is the right fit for an employee in Saifr these days?
I think the right fit is someone who cares about the client experience. And so we spend a lot of time and effort with clients to try and understand how they're using the product, what is working, what is not working. And so we look for people who can sit down and have that conversation with the client, no matter what function that they are in. Because a lot of times we'll go to a client meeting where it does require an engineer to be in front of the client and speaking to the client about a specific aspect of the product. And so that skill set cuts across the entirety of every function that we have in the company, whether it's in marketing, whether it's in direct sales, whether it's engineering, whether it's in the data science. As a matter of fact, by nature of what we do, all data scientists have to speak with clients. And so consequently, that's one of the key skill sets that we look for. And then obviously, depending on the function, if someone is going to be writing Java code, for example, well, yes, they need to know Java, right? But I would say that the ability for you to understand and be willing to sit and learn the client journey, no matter how many times you've been through it, it shows up differently with different clients. And so that ability to sit patiently and think and listen and ask questions and be curious, that's what we look for. Because again, given we're a small company, given our size, the only way that we're going to grow is to solve real world problems. And you can only do that by listening to people with those real world problems.
It's interesting you mentioned they need to be able to write Java. In truth, in very short order, they won't need to be able to write Java, but they will need to have a certain amount of soft skills, if you will, that kind of, I mean, obviously they want to be able to prompt properly and be able to QA and architect, but the raw coding actually, I think is going to end up going away. But I'm curious about, because I think about it a lot here, culture, company culture. How do you get people kind of on the same page? I don't know whether everybody at Saifr, it's almost nobody these days has everybody in office, but how do you think about culture when you start to hire folks who might not necessarily be coming in every day and kind of, drinking the same Kool-Aid?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that it's the set of beliefs that you have, right? Culture starts from the top. I think that you have to model the behaviors that you expect people to follow. And so in our case, yes, you are quite right. I mean, we presented the use case to the investment committee in late fall 2020, so full-on pandemic. So the idea was basically 5 slides that we presented. Once the funding for that was approved, I started hiring. So the entire team that built the product was hired via Zoom. The entire company, we had never met a single person. I met, actually, when I started at the lab, 3 days later, we all started working from home. And so I had met the person who ultimately became my first product manager for about an hour. And that was the only person that I had met. At that point, he was in another function within the lab that I had met. The CTO, everyone in the company that actually built the product. So we spent 2021 building it. Everything was still on lockdown in 2021. And so consequently, how do you get people to buy into and believe, not just buy into, but believe in the culture? I think we were at an advantage because Fidelity has a great culture to start with. And so I think that we were able to learn from that as well and impart that culture onto the Saifr team. But what makes us different, as you might imagine, from the rest is that of the firm is that we have to move faster because we're not a huge company where you have a small team.
Fidelity's
right?
pace is a little bit different.
You're a small team of, at the beginning, it was just 8 of us trying to build an MVP and get it out of the door. And so consequently, we looked for people who had that same mentality, people who came from a startup background, people who were used to that, who can work with a lot of ambiguity. Because big companies provide safety, there are well-defined processes, there's less chaos and less ambiguity. Small companies, lots of chaos, lots of ambiguity, and so people can work in that type of environment. That was crucial. So taking that and pairing that with the great culture that Fidelity already had in place was kind of like the perfect scenario for that. And the support that we were able to get from Fidelity with large also helped tremendously.
Yeah, Val, this was great. It sounds like a tremendous opportunity, and it sounds like you're off on a great path with Saifr. Best of luck. We're going to keep tracking you here at Solutions Review. We appreciate all the time you've given us, and yeah, best of luck for the rest of the year and going forward with Saifr.
Thank you, and stay tuned. I think we have a lot of exciting announcements coming up in the next few months. So stay tuned.
Great.
Excellent. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.